Psychological Disorders in Literature by Lily Nelson. My project looks at the effects of psychological disorders on characters in novels, and how we as readers ultimately read the novel. I focused mainly on autism and schizophrenia. My guiding questions were, as I read, 1. How do psychological disorders dehumanize people in a sense, if at all? 2. How can a psychological disorder affect basic human abilities? 3. How credible are the characters in the story who have a psychological disorder? So I looked for a book that would scientifically explain the psychological disorders I was interested in, as well as novels that would go along with what I had found in the more scientific book. The first book I chose was more non-fiction-y, entitled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, by a psychologist and neurologist named Oliver Sacks. The book mainly draws upon patient anecdotes from the author's line of work. He explains the psychological disease each patient had, with fake identities, of course, to ensure their confidentiality, and describes how they behave and interacted with the world. The narrator is Oliver Sacks throughout the entire book. He tells the story of each patient scientifically as well as with a lot of humor, making it relatable to anyone. One story he touched on was that of the twins. The twins are young boys suffering from autism. Autism is a disease affecting the brain's development by messing with how the brain organizes and stores information. This makes it difficult for people with autism to communicate or have normal social interactions. But back to the twins. The twins love solving math problems and would make algorithms in their head and take turns solving each other's algorithm and trying to figure it out. I guess you can tell they're pretty intelligent boys with limitless memories. However, they were very antisocial and didn't talk to anyone but each other. Definitely hard to communicate with. So how exactly do the twins relate back to the guiding question? Well, they show a psychological disorder doesn't fully dehumanize people. Though they can't really have normal relations with people unlike them, they're pretty good at math. There's always going to be that unfortunate fact, however, that they have a difficulty communicating with others due to their autism. But really, would you be able to handle that? Having problems getting your ideas across and communicating effectively with others? Try telling me what you did last night.
A-R-E or D?
Wait, like in any of the words?
In any of the words.
Can you write these down?
No.
A-R-E or B.
Can't do that.
I
I
let
I wouldn't to that's not proper English.
food took some sleep.
I
Did sheets
I did go out.
in my mouth?
With
TV
dog.
Another character Sacks talks about is the possessed lady, who seems to have Tourette syndrome and schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a disorder affecting the brain that can cause one to hear voices in their heads, act out, and have multiple personalities. Those affected aren't able to interact normally in a social environment in extreme cases. Because of the lady's disorders, she would yell randomly at people in the streets of New York and just mimic hundreds of people's faces that are walking by, and as a result, she really didn't have her own identity. On to the next one. I also read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. The story is about Christopher Boone, who's 15 years old and he lives with autism, and he actually narrates the story. It begins with his obsession with a dead dog he found on his neighbor's lawn, and it ends up with him snooping around the entire neighborhood trying to look for the murderer, even though the coppers tell him to stay away, don't help. He still tries to go, and his dad tells him not to do it, but he still does. He not only finds the murderer, which actually ends up being his dad, but he also finds that he has a long-lost mother living in London. He decides to face his fear of like socially putting himself out there and goes to find her. And in the end, not only does he find his mom, but we as readers are like, dang, he's like awesome. Like I can't believe he actually narrated this entire experience through a book on his own. Christopher Boone and autism. So in the novel, it never actually says that Christopher has autism, but you can kind of infer that that's what he has based on his symptoms. Like he loves numbers, and he kind of reminds me of the twins that were in the Sachs book that I read. He has very poor social skills, and at one point he even like pulls out a knife to this young lady who's like trying to help him, and he's like, "I'm gonna cut off your fingers if you don't move away." And like the lady was just like literally trying to help him, but he just like freaked out. And I thought the knife kind of symbolized his discomfort with social interaction. Like it's ironic that every time in the novel when he feels uneasy, he starts to grab his little Swiss Army knife in his pocket and like starts going into detail about how he's rubbing it and like, oh, it's here. And like, I don't know, it's basically like as a protection, I guess, against harm. And what he thinks is harming him is social interaction. And as readers, we even feel a little discomforted. Like, I mean, it's obvious like that he's being kind of weird. But he doesn't take hints, and he doesn't really fully understand what people are trying to say, even if they're being sarcastic. Like his mom just left one day spontaneously, and he really believed that she died. But like, wouldn't there be a funeral if she actually had died? So Christopher and my guiding question. Yes, he was dehumanized, because at first he couldn't efficiently interact with mankind. But this revelation in the end, and finding his mother, leads readers to believe that though this may be true, it is possible to associate efficiently with mankind through this disorder. It's like an underdog story. He stopped himself from being dehumanized by challenging his disorder. Secondly, since autism affects communication, it's socially difficult for those who are affected by it to stop their fear of social interaction. Lastly, his outlook on life, his hatred for groups of people, and his attitude towards his father and strangers make the story kind of questionable. He doesn't pick up on certain clues such as his mother leaving, therefore it's hard for readers to pick up on it. His motives for a lot of the novel are unclear, though it is clear that his focus is to make himself feel part of society through socially integrating himself, writing a book, and finding his mom. The last novel I read is also a fiction novel and is entitled I Never Promised You a Rose Garden by Joanne Greenberg. The story is mainly about Deborah, who's a 16-year-old girl, and she's suicidal, and she has all these voices in her head. And at the age of 5, she had a tumor around her urethra, which was removed. And after this, she started showing signs of schizophrenia. She has her own separate reality and identity in a land she calls the Kingdom of Ir. She created this kingdom to cope with the anti-Semitic comments of her peers one year when she goes to camp. And her parents never thought she had an illness, sort of just like passed it off as nothing. Her dad, Jacob, was the real one who was like, nah, she doesn't have anything wrong with her. And her mom, Esther, was like, hey, it's best if we take her to a mental hospital. She obviously has something wrong with her. Deborah didn't want to make friends, she hated the outside world, and she always isolated herself. And when she finally gets to the hospital, Dr. Freed works with her closely to try and gain her trust and help Deborah open up to her. And Deborah finally begins to make some friends in the ward and in the institution, something she really wouldn't do in the real world. Eventually, she tries to go out to the real world, like outside of the institution, and live her own life. But she started hearing these voices of Ir again in the place that she used to retreat to, and she starts becoming frightened, and so she returns back to the mental hospital for more treatment. And finally, after that treatment, she breaks free of Ir and literally accepts reality. Deborah lives with schizophrenia, but decides to act on it. She goes into a psychiatric hospital, starting off with negative thoughts due to her disorder. For example, she says at one point that she likes the bars on the windows of the psychiatric hospital. I took this as, hey, I'm trying to lock myself out of reality anyway, like I do with Ir, the fantasy kingdom I make up. Like, she really hates reality, or the life that normal people live, because she struggles with living that way because of her disorder. She also goes by the name of Jonas instead of Deborah because this is the name she has in Ir. She creates multiple personalities to cope with her real identity and unhappiness with it. This is a common symptom of schizophrenia. Also, she doesn't like having real relationships with people because people don't give her a chance because she's a Jew and all of her neighbors are literally anti-Semitic. So she really doesn't have the opportunity to make a real relationship. So when she tries to make a relationship with Dr. Freed, it's really hard for her because she's never had to do it before because she's never had people who are willing to have a relationship with her like that. So in reality, she definitely lacks the ability to build successful relationships. How does Deborah relate to my guiding questions? Well, Deborah is representative of Joanne Greenberg, the author of the novel. Both have schizophrenia. Deborah's doctor, Dr. Freed, is named after Joanne's, Frieda Fromm Reichmann. Joanne writes the novel primarily under the name Hannah Green, another persona which is pretty interesting. But the fact that Joanne can write a genius novel about her experience shows her ability to use her experiences with schizophrenia to her advantage through publishing them. So back to Deborah. Deborah leaves the institution, then comes back, then leaves again, showing her persistence. She wants to do something about her disorder. She doesn't just let it negatively impact her. It's a struggle. But she wants to accept reality, and she wants to have the basic human right of building relationships. In terms of Deborah as a credible character, I think she could be, but it's all subjective. Deborah is valuable as a character because she's based upon Joanne's experience with schizophrenia. But since she is based upon someone else's experience, it's all subjective. Lastly, like I said before, Deborah is persistent, which aided in her not being dehumanized. She pushes herself to move past her disorder and accept reality. Psychological disorders in novels are present and do alter the way the book can be read. For the characters, they can change how they are perceived in society. For example, they can be seen as dehumanized because of their disorder. Some may believe they are lacking something, but these novels told me that only those with psychological disorders who don't try to live their lives will be dehumanized, because that's what humans do. We live. And so in order to do this, the characters in the novels and in the non-fiction anecdotes I read made the best of their situations and used their disorders to their advantage. The twins, for example, used their autism to focus on logic and math. Christopher is very observant, literal, and persistent because of his autism, which made him good at snooping around for information on the dead dog Wellington. He found his mom while he was at it. And Deborah was very persistent by giving Dr. Freed a chance and allowing for the treatment to help ease her back into reality, thus battling her schizophrenia. Obviously, there are those who are affected by the disorder more than others, and those severely affected, this may not necessarily be true for them. But communication skills are obviously affected in all of these disorders, and this may affect the way the story is told, quote-unquote, accurately. However, there is never a 100% reliable story because storytelling is subjective. Whatever their story is, it is valuable because it is how they received the events that took place.